The Reconstruction years of 1865 and 1890 were not just important for the South, but also were really important for what's called the modern school era. And it was during the modern school era in which school became more organized, particularly given the different migrations that were happening at the time and the different social, economic, and political climates. So there are three specific movements that all of you students in conversation Blackboard that will become very influential in just the social dynamics of both the North and of the South during this period. And that would be a rise in immigration, a rise in, excuse me, a rise in urbanization, and a rise in industrialization. And the last two all of them interconnect in important ways, but the last two are the ones that connect the most, particularly as we get seeing the shift in work. And when we have this shift in work, a different sort of concentration on inner city areas, because immigration would also be on the rise. A lot of this work would be work that was doled out to immigrants because they were cheaper to employ. We would see the creation of what scholars would call slums, or the inner city ghettos, if you will. And so, between a lot of people sort of being in this one area, between sort of a limited economic opportunities, we're thinking about how a lot of this factory work didn't necessarily provide a lot of money, but also about sort of living in cramped quarters. We're thinking about how some of the immigrants who had been here for some years prior were sort of gaining a sense of territorialism, in the sense that they were becoming very competitive with new and incoming immigrants of the time. There was a lot of social conflict that was going on, coupled with a lot of political corruption as well, that was sort of exploiting this very right moment of a change in industry, as well as an influx out of a lot of people. And while we would see school gain sort of great importance during the Common School movement, there would be a great need for become more organized, given the fact that there were sort of more people coming to school. So for the very first time, we would see that school was becoming mandatory. We would see that there would be age grading within school. We would see that there was co-ed classrooms, and some of that is sort of supported by this idea that boys would be here if there were girls in the classroom, since it acts more gentleman-like when a lady was around, which is because of how that reinforces gender role. But also as a window to how school becomes a place to not only introduce but to sort of maintain gender roles as well. And we'll get in a few more classes, particularly when we look at gender. But all of that sort of organization around school in a more setting would fall under the umbrella of the bureaucratization of school. And so this is when school sort of becomes, in a much more clearer sense, runs as a bureaucracy, so that there's a focus on the actual structure of school, not necessarily the pedagogy that's going on. And so as you read in Urban and Wagner, they sort of compared school at this particular time to a factory, and the way that a factory runs. That it was sort of very straightforward. It was very much about rote repetition, memorization. And while there was sort of progressive thinking around how school is sort of organized, that progressive thinking wasn't necessarily progressive in the way that we think about progressive. It was progressive in the sense that, again, school would function very much like a factory. And so we think about a factory, we're thinking about how a factory is able to sort of have a lot of workers sort of work on this assembly line and sort of produce work, which doesn't necessarily change some of the social hierarchy or economic hierarchy outside of school. And so Um, this is this is the importance of sort of reading John Dewey alongside reading the organization of school, because for Dewey, the way that it's organized also sort of reflects sort of educational beliefs about how education should run. So we along with bureaucratization, we would also see specialization, also see differentiation. Differentiation being sort of these different curriculums that will be introduced, ones that will be more sort of work related, which is again sort of tied to that increased industrialization, whereas other curriculums might be sort of geared towards different trades that were sort of outside of the realm of vocational, but perhaps more domestic, right? And so we're seeing how even differentiation or differentiated curriculums could also be gendered. But we also saw within the organization of schooling a shift of power between that of a local community to a city, so that the shift in power meant that decision making was not just sort of made by local communities, but larger school districts. The very fact that there were school districts was something that would happen also during this time. School districts being run by superintendents. The very existence of a superintendent would happen for the very first time as well. One of the things that we mentioned in conversation was how majority of these superintendents were male, and majority of the women that they oversaw were female, which created which sort of creates an interesting power dynamic. Um, I mean, even today, as we sort of think about the overrepresentation of females within elementary education, and the overrepresentation of males in power, like a position uh, like the superintendency. So John Dewey sort of critiques not so much that in particular, but sort of critiques the way that we think about school, the purpose of school, and its relation to society. And in thinking about a democratic society and how we would want to have a democratic society, it was his belief that we need to understand school as a social process, and that if we want society to be democratic, then we need school to be democratic, because the two are inextricably linked. The two are inextricably linked. One is the reflection of the other. And so the ways in which we want to sort of think about a larger society, it needs to, it sort of requires us to reimagine the way that we think about school.